This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, an update from the market. So at today's close, the JSE Stock 40 has clawed back most of the losses that we saw from July through to September. It's taken its year-to-date rise to about 13.8%. Index heavyweight Naspers accounted for the bulk of the gains in this session. The coal miner, Exxaro Resources, closed nearly 5% higher today, taking its year-to-date price rise to over 20%. The most recent market data from the Kenyan Capital Markets Regulator pointed to an interesting change, an inflow in cash from foreign investors in Q3, which shares about $8.4 million bought by non-resident parties compared to outflows of over $18 million in the second quarter of the year. Here's what's coming up tonight. The US will suspend Ethiopia from the AGOA trade deal as unrest in the country continues to escalate. The COP26 grouping vows to put climate change at the heart of finance. And we'll have the latest on a fishing spat between the United Kingdom and France. We start with one of the continent's biggest stories at the moment, a hard-hitting statement from the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who's pledged to vanquish his government's enemies. He made the remarks on the one-year anniversary of the start of the war in the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia. A moment of silence was observed at a candlelit ceremony to commemorate those killed on the 3rd of November 2020. The conflict has now made the Ethiopian government impose a 6-month-long state of emergency. Tigrayan forces, on the other hand, have indicated that they will advance on the capital, Addis Ababa, after claiming to have taken significant territory in the northern part of Ethiopia. But the Prime Minister insists that the government troops will protect the country's sovereignty.
This pit, which is dug very deep, will be where the enemy will be buried, not where Ethiopia disintegrates. We will bury this enemy with our blood and bones, and make the glory of Ethiopia high up again.
Now, Zimbabwean mining companies are pushing the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, the country's central bank, to essentially ring-fence the 40% surrender requirement component and allow firms to pay for essential services and taxes at the official exchange rate in order to rescue the multi-billion-dollar sector. This development comes at a time when miners are losing 20% of gross export proceeds due to these exchange rates disparities we're seeing in the country.
A recent State of Zimbabwe's mining industry survey found that the majority of industry players are confident of ramping up production, expect to use retained profits to expand operations, and the overall industry's capacity utilization is expected to grow to 83% in 2022. However, hopes of realizing those bullish forecasts may be dashed if mining houses are not allowed to retain more of their own foreign currency earnings. Foreign exchange controls compel mining companies to surrender 40% of their export receipts to the central bank at the official exchange rate, despite incurring domestic costs pegged at the much higher parallel market rate.
Mining houses are saying that really they're losing value by selling their money to the central bank at the 98 to 1 level. Unfortunately, the problem is this, is the exchange rate real? And I think this is where the debate rages in the marketplace. Is the government or the Reserve Bank artificially holding the exchange rate at 99 when the market's trading at 180? Or is the 180 correct and actually the 99 is an artificially held rate? I would premise that it's somewhere between the two.
The Chamber of Mines is lobbying authorities to retain at least 80% of foreign currency earnings. Government, on the other hand, is looking for more hard currency sources to pay for critical exports such as electricity and to fund the weekly foreign currency auction. Failing to grant the industry the desired reprieve could leave players hamstrung.
We are actually making it difficult for the mining industry to meet the USD 12 billion, value by 2023. Because that is going to make, exploration difficult. It is going to make, because I said exploration is internal funds. is going to be difficult if internal funds are restricted by these surrender levels. And we are also going to retrogress in terms of mining, because generally all these costs at the end of the day affect the whole value chain in the mining industry.
The mining industry report also noted that the industry profitability in 2022 is expected lower than 2021 due to rising operating costs. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
All right, then a revisit to our earlier top story. November the 3rd essentially marks a whole year of the civil conflict going on in Ethiopia. As we speak at the moment, TPLF forces have advanced relatively close to the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. They're about 400 kilometers away from that. They've captured two strategic towns essentially on a key road linking Tigray, the northern province, into Addis Ababa. Let's get a sense of exactly where things stand at the moment. Girum Chala joins us now live from the Ethiopian capital. Girum, give us a sense of what day-to-day life is like in Addis at the moment. A state of emergency has been declared, but what are day-to-day operations like in the city and its environs?
Ramah, as you said, a nationwide state of emergency has been declared yesterday. This is the second day, of course, and the city, by and large, it's calm. Day-to-day activity is continuing. We've been trying to maneuver around town, also doing our jobs and also trying to observe what's happening, if there are any changes. The only change we've seen is there are checkpoints here and there. Police ask you questions as they are mandated to based on the state of emergency guidelines themselves, unless and otherwise that's the issue. The other activities of the city remain to be the same as it used to be. At the moment, as you can see behind me, cars are a bit low. People are going home early based on the security alert that has been given for them, not because of the city, but the whole environment itself. So far, things are calm.
All right, so that's the situation in Addis Ababa. But walk us through the latest on the front line of the conflict between federal forces on one hand and those of the TPLF on the other.
Rama, in the northern part of Ethiopia, if I heard you very well, conflict continues at the moment between the Ethiopian National Defense Force and also TPLF. There are also OLA, Oromo Liberation Army forces in there as well. This OLA force used to operate in western Ethiopia. Now they have moved, and TPLF has already announced that a merger has happened, and they are contemplating to march into the capital city of Addis Ababa and try to remove the government. At the moment, Ethiopian National Defense Force, as you have heard it from the Prime Minister herself, seem to be determined to repel the danger that is posed against the city and the country's sovereignty at the same time. And they are pushing, and fighting has continued in Kombolcha and other towns at the moment. And this has intensified by the hour since we have last reported here. So we can report that war has continued, and results are going to be coming out, be announced by the government sooner.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Girum Chala there live for us in Addis Ababa. We're still in Ethiopia. The country will be suspended from the United States Tariff-Free African Growth and Opportunity Act in a sign of the continuing deterioration in relations between the countries amid the Ethiopian ongoing civil conflict in Tigray. Now, Ethiopia is one of the three African countries alongside Guinea and Mali that will lose access to the US market under AGOA from the 1st of January 2022. Now, AGOA essentially provides tariff-free access to the US market for African countries. AGOA brings Ethiopia roughly $100 million in hard cash a year. It directly generates employment for about 100,000 people, most of them women in southern Ethiopia working in textile factories that then export that apparel to the US. The UN has reported massacres and mass starvation as the government's war against the Tigray People's Liberation Front continues. All right, then, so let's explore what's going on, the conflict in Ethiopia in a bit more detail. Anne Fitzgerald is a professor of international security and the director of the Balsley School of International Affairs as well. She's joining us live on the program. So let's start with your assessment of the conflict as it's escalating at the moment. TPLF forces advanced so far as far south as Dessie and Kombolcha. What's your assessment of how this conflict has evolved, especially since October?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please continue.
Oh, great, because you're a bit faint. But yeah, so since, I guess the difference between since early October and now is that in early October, we saw TPLF fighters positioned across North Wallo communities. And now after they had committed incursions into both the Amhara regional state of Ethiopia and Afar, now what we seem to be seeing is a coalescing of those fighters, with more being brought down in truckloads to the front line, and a channel coming in from the northwest into towns like Kombolcha and Dessie, and a standoff between the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and these fighters. But we're also seeing reports that there have been infiltrations in the communities in Dessie of insurgents arming local residents who have attacked the ENDF forces from behind as they were repelling the main Tigrayan fighter force out of these towns. So that weakened their capacity. We've seen the TPLF fighters reportedly take a stronger footing and stronger hold in these areas. And so what we're seeing now is not only a war of attrition as far as human capacity is concerned, and weaponry, which the ENDF forces are targeting through airstrikes, but we're also seeing a war playing out in Wallo, the Wallo region of Amhara. And I think this area is very strategically important as well, because those who have control of Kombolcha and Dessie are in very close proximity to be in control of Ethiopia's, one of its main lifelines and main arteries, which is the road connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti. This is a road that brings in supplies from all over the world, is fundamental to import-export activity, and that notwithstanding, Dessie and Kombolcha serve as the industrial heartland of the Amhara regional state.
Looking at this from a logistics perspective, the further and further away TPLF is operating from its home ground, the more they're going to struggle, at least in theory, to keep the supply lines running. I mean, given the disparity, at least on paper, in force strength between the ENDF on one hand and the TPLF on the other, how is it that the TPLF managed to make these gains and operate so far from essentially their home base in Tigray province?
Well, don't forget there are no federal forces in Tigray regional state. So in effect, the TPLF fighters have a clear line, if they can now avoid airstrikes, to bringing their armaments, weaponry, artillery down to the front line. It's also a common known tactic of insurgency warfare to leave weapons and artillery at different strategic front lines. So there is clear access for them to come into the border, and they have committed border incursions to maintain a presence across the North Wallo region. Now, that said, we are hearing reports in local media that the federal forces have recaptured some of those North Wallo regions, like Sokoto, like Gashena, like Waldalandananta. And so whether or not we see a sort of encirclement and the extent to which that encirclement can be reinforced anymore from supplies coming down from Mekelle depends on the airstrike activity and depends on the extent to which the federal forces might intercept those supply lines. But over and above that, insurgency warfare is all about the people. And that's why it's known as the war amongst the people. So it's trying to, the objective of TPLF fighters is also to delegitimize the government, to loot communities, to loot and destroy businesses, private residences. So these Amharan communities will ask questions as to where the government is and why the government isn't supporting it. And that's part of the tactic, part of the strategy. And so it's not all about weapons and supply lines. It's about communication, information campaigns, propaganda campaigns. And we're seeing a lot of those being sent widely, claiming to be en route to marching into Addis. that in itself will be psychological warfare and a propaganda campaign.
Indeed, it did trigger a fairly interesting conversation on and off Twitter, especially in the last 24, 48 hours. But let's move on to the international dimension of this. The U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Fettleman, he's going to be in the country, I believe, in the next 24 hours. But is there more leverage that the U.S. can bring to bear on both sides, the TPLF and the ENDF, in order to essentially bring this conflict to an end?
I think the U.S. can play a very important role in this conflict, in bringing this conflict to an end. And that has to do with the fact that as of yet, it has not lodged the threat of any punitive measures towards the TPLF fighters. So for many analysts, including myself, it's quite ironic that punitive measures have been lodged towards the legitimate democratically elected government of Ethiopia, but no punitive measures in the form of travel restrictions, freeze of bank accounts, freeze of foreign assets have been lodged towards the TPLF leaders.
But how effective, though, would that actually be? Because, I mean, for the TPLF, assuming we know who the leaders of this particular, the effective leaders, rather, of this grouping are at the moment, travel restrictions, they probably don't want to leave the country anyway. Asset freezes, do we know what assets they have in the US? I mean, what's the actual utility of these measures?
Well, I think you'll find that TPLF leaders do have foreign assets, and they do have overseas assets and overseas properties. So I do think that some of these measures would be effective. But beyond those measures, calls for them to lay down their arms, even the bare basics of a cessation of hostilities on that side of the conflict. I mean, don't forget, the fighting is outside of their region, the Tigray region. They have pushed deep into Amhara. The reason for this, they claim, is to break a siege that there didn't seem to be any evidence of, and humanitarian blockades that there didn't seem to be compelling evidence of. So what is the objective here, and why isn't the international community standing behind a legitimate government, which was voted in by 80% of the population, and stability of the country to prevent this humanitarian crisis, destruction to humanity writ large, from being unnecessarily prolonged? So I do think calls to lay down arms, calls for surrender, efforts not to try to classify the TPLF leaders, which, don't forget, called for the attack which murdered thousands of federal forces on the Northern Command a year ago today, to bring them to a position of moral equivalency with a democratically elected government. That's not the answer that Ethiopia and the Ethiopian population is looking for, or the majority of the Ethiopian population. And that's not a sustainable solution for a democratic pathway that the Ethiopian people have chosen.
All right, so one last question for you, again, on the whole regional dimension, because we saw Sudan and Egypt running joint exercises roughly around this time this year, but that was ahead of talks around the GRD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Are we seeing any signs at the moment of overt involvement in this conflict by Sudan or by Egypt? And what would an ideal outcome, in quotes, look like from Egypt's point of view?
Yeah, it was indeed ironic that probably around 10 days from today, a year ago, we saw a joint military exercise entitled Nile Eagle, staged by Sudan and Egypt jointly. And this was slightly bellicose and intimidating in name alone, let alone in action and flying in close proximity of the just started Tigray conflict. Egypt and the military component of the Sudanese traditional government have adopted quite a bellicose position towards Ethiopia. And this has been very disappointing based on the long-standing, long-term relationship, which was fairly strong, between Ethiopia and Sudan. It's also been disappointing based on the great economic potential of Ethiopia's water infrastructure development project and plans in the form of the GERD the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance down, because of the economic benefits it could bring not only to Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, but to the rest of the Nile riparian states. Egypt obviously has a close relationship with the United States. This is evidenced just by way of the 80 million in economic support that the U.S. given to the country this year. It's also given 30 million in the form of military cooperation support. They have a close relationship, those countries, in supporting the Middle East and the Middle East peace talks. But I don't think that Egypt has a stake in any particular political outcome in Ethiopia. I think Egypt's stake is for some chaos and instability to be maintained to prevent Ethiopia from exploring its share of Nile resources. And let's not forget that's 85% of the Nile resources, which, because of its economic hardships and the poverty that it's been challenged with over the years, it has yet to explore. But this is a national water infrastructure project. It has already proven to have not altered the levels of the Nile waters, and therefore not a threat to Egypt or Sudan. In fact, it brings great benefits to Sudan in the form of flood defenses, in the form of food security, which Sudan is desperate for at the moment, particularly since the latest increased hike in food prices and the stripping of subsidies for fuel and food, wheat in particular, that there's been a public outcry over and big protests and demonstrations towards the recent military coup. So we're seeing short-term interests at play here. And I think it would be very helpful and constructive for the US to temper its position on issuing punitive charges to the TPLF leaders, as well as other parties, temper those positions by some encouragement for regional economic cooperation instead of regional security postures and positions, which in some cases are very threatening.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Professor Anne Fitzgerald, thank you very much. Time now for a run through some company headlines. Let's start in the world of tech. Telkom Kenya has announced a partnership with Ericsson and NEC XON to deepen mobile broadband connectivity in Kenya. Now, the move is part of the telco strategy to try and accelerate the digital transformation in East Africa's largest economy and to bridge the digital divide. The firm is targeting to set up 2,000 additional 4G sites in Kenya by 2023 at an estimated cost of about $100 million. The partnership will see the company expand its 4G LTE coverage by a factor of 4 from its current total of 590 4G sites. Old Mutual's private equity arm is in talks to buy Long for Life, the investment company founded by the entrepreneur Brian Joffrey. The buyout firm has funds available that could go towards an acquisition of the Joburg-based group, but a final agreement is yet to be reached and a deal may not be finalized. Long for Life owns the retailer Sportsman's Warehouse and the beauty salon chain Sorbet. It was valued at over $260 million as of Tuesday's market close. Absa Kenya has signed a deal with Toyota Automart Kenya to finance clients who buy both used personal and commercial vehicles. The agreement between the two sides will provide up to 85% financing at a 4-year window at an interest rate of 13.5%. Customers will also have access to 100% insurance premium financing and a range of other insurance products, even a credit card if you want, worth up to $2,600 upon assessment to support vehicle maintenance and fuel purchases. And Germany's largest carrier, Lufthansa, has posted a $20 million profit before interest and tax in the third quarter of the year. That's the airline's first net earnings first profit since the start of the pandemic, compared to a loss of nearly $1.5 billion a year ago. The earnings were boosted by the easing of pandemic restrictions, travel restrictions, and not stronger demand in the summer. Lufthansa says bookings are back to about 4/5 or so of pre-crisis levels, with strong sales, especially in premium classes. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. At the latest event in COP26, the focus is on putting climate change at the heart of finance. But can that really happen? And businesses in Uganda feel the heat as the government extends school closures in order to contain the pandemic.
As we know it, is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how whole stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. So, global attention is turned from leaders at the UN Climate Conference taking place in Scotland to the state treasuries and financiers responsible for finding the money to carry out the pledges to cut emissions and build the infrastructure we need in the long run. Now, among the questions being tabled are who should pay and how the funds can be channeled through the financial system quickly and effectively. And just as important, exactly how the world will actually meet those pledges, particularly in the developing world. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, it's an umbrella group that includes all the major Western banks as well as insurers and asset managers. They announced that firms responsible for managing over $130 trillion in capital, that's roughly 40% of the world's financial assets, have signed up to what they're describing as a fair share of decarbonisation. All right, then, so let's take apart the day of negotiations we're seeing now with our correspondent, John Beaver, joins us now live from Glasgow. So, John, bring us up to speed with the latest from today. What are the key highlights that have happened today?
Well, the world leaders have all gone home, and so it was left to the money men and the money women to open their wallets and try and work out how they're going to pay for some of these big headline-grabbing announcements that we heard over the first couple of days here in Glasgow. As you've been saying there, a huge amount of emphasis has been placed on the private sector to help with this as well. All these different organisations that are worth somewhere in the region of 130 trillion, well, they're now going to need to start saying, right, we're going to be spending money on X, Y, and Z, and exactly what they're going to spend the money on. Well, that's what a lot of protesters and a lot of climate scientists have been saying. That's what we need to hear more details about. It's all very well having these bold statements saying we're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars being spent on these things, but we actually need some very firm answers, and we need them quickly because time is running out and the money is crucial to enabling everything to happen.
Indeed, and taxes, of course, are a big part of that. So how are different countries approaching the question of imported emissions, for example, like those that might come up if you're importing, for example, soybeans into the UK to make the soy milk that may be used to make the soy milk lattes that we're seeing in Glasgow, for example? How are countries dealing with that question?
Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because it's something that actually it's very easy, especially for rich Western countries, to ignore. If you import a lot of the things that are very emission heavy and not particularly good for the planet, well, then that's not a problem. The UK, you know, the spotlight is on here because here we are in Glasgow for COP26. So there haven't been any firm answers from the UK. We've been hearing these promises about making sure they better reflect their total emissions, and that includes imported emissions. But I was speaking to some protesters earlier who were protesting against greenwashing. This is both businesses and they say governments as well, who try and put forward these very clear ideas saying, look how well we're doing, look at how progressive we are, whereas actually you have things like imported emissions on the other hand, and these are things that are being swept under the rug. So expect to hear more about that as we progress through the next 2 weeks here at COP26.
Indeed, and of course, as we spoke about a little earlier, raising finance was one of the key focus areas today. A lot of these numbers come up. We're going to provide X amount of money for adaptation, X amount of money for mitigation, and so on and so forth. But did we hear any specific timelines being announced today?
Well, 2023 was a number that was put forward when it came to wealthy countries helping developing nations with $100 billion a year. Now that is a figure that they have missed repeatedly over the past few years. So 2023 is later than everyone wanted. A lot of people wanted it to be immediate. UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak said he was optimistic they would hit the 2023 deadline, and then for 5 years after that they would help, and that's the money for the developing countries. But in terms of these other grand plans, we're hearing, it's 2025 and it's 2030. And again, protesters saying this isn't good enough. We need immediate answers. Of course, on the other hand, we have all of these economies trying to recover from the coronavirus pandemic. Some of them have been absolutely devastated by it, especially those that rely on businesses such as tourism. They've been really hard hit by the pandemic. So suddenly being asked to find huge amounts of money is very difficult for them. Of course, you could argue this isn't a surprise. We know that climate change is here and is causing a devastating impact. And actually, this should have been done 10 years ago. So what we really need is immediate funding now. And certainly we're going to be hoping that over the next few days, we hear some more immediate goals rather than these 5 to 10 year plans that we've been hearing so far.
Indeed, let's see what the negotiators do come up with. John Beaver there in Glasgow, Scotland. Now, the question of finance, of course, is a key one. China says that finance is a key to addressing climate change, and the fulfillment of financial commitments by developed countries is an important issue, and it's an important matter of concern for developing economies.
Developed countries are mainly responsible for global climate change and carbon emissions. Providing funds to developing countries to help them better cope with climate change is not only an inescapable moral responsibility of developed countries, but also an international obligation that they must fulfill under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement. Developed countries should show real sincerity in addressing climate change, step up efforts and improve quality, honor their commitment of providing $100 billion in climate funding to developing countries every year, and make their due contribution to addressing climate change and global climate governance.
It can often be quite easy to talk about climate change in the abstract without recognizing the effect it has on individual lives. Here's one of those stories. Climate change is actually pushing poverty levels higher and higher in parts of rural Kenya. The government over there has declared drought in parts of the country, even as the country's meteorological department is giving a very bleak outlook for the expected rainy season this month. CGTN's Penina Karibe brings us a story from Kitui County. It's in eastern Kenya. It's one of the counties that's been heavily affected by drought.
The expanse that greets you in Mithikwani village in Kenya's Kitui County, a vast area of parched earth and dried up trees. It is only mid-morning, but temperatures here are punishing. There is not a single speck of green in sight. This is the landscape that covers most of the county, located about 180 kilometers east of Nairobi. On this hot morning, Priscilla Mweni is getting started on her day. It is a standard routine that she follows each day, and most of the work involves fetching water. In Kitui County, water is a scarce commodity which families spend hours looking for. Mweni, however, is lucky. She doesn't have to walk for miles to get it. Just a few minutes walk from her house is a borehole, but she says it wasn't always there.
I would wake up before 6 a.m. I wouldn't even light the fire. I would load up the donkey and hit the road looking for water. I would walk about 10 or 12 kilometers. Once I got there, I would find other people waiting to fetch the water. We would queue for very long hours. We would have our livestock with us and make sure they first drink the water, and then fill up our jerry cans and load them up again on the donkey for the journey back home. I would arrive at about 1 p.m. That's when I would cook breakfast. The children would go to school in the morning without eating anything.
To save herself from a daily 12-kilometer trek, she would use the water sparingly. As for the livestock, they would go for 2 days after that without drinking any water. She wouldn't do the laundry, instead opting to only wash a few essential clothes. That way, the water would last a few days. The county is classified as a semi-arid region. In a year, it receives roughly 71 centimeters or about 20 inches of rainfall.
Kitui County receives 2 seasons of rain in a year. There's the first season, which locals call the long rain season, which begins in March and ends in May. And then there's a second season, which begins in October to December. But this year, the first season of rains failed. The end result, dry rivers such as this one. It is one of the 3 main rivers in this area. The local chief tells us the last time water flowed in this river was a year ago. That drought is now pushing the local community further to the brink.
The Kenyan government has listed the county among 11 others currently experiencing drought. The local chief tells us the situation is becoming difficult to handle.
Some of them are small-scale farmers. So if the rain fails, I don't understand how the situation will be, not unless we cry for the government to assist.
The lack of water has led to a loss of livelihoods. Mutinda Muyuma is a small-scale farmer who had ventured into onion farming. He tells me he planted the onions on this 1-acre piece of land. Unfortunately, due to a lack of water, they all dried up. Now, he's hoping the upcoming rainy season will be on time and plans to plant maize and beans. Livestock too are feeling the pinch of the drought. There's not much for them to eat or drink. Some people have stored up a bit of reserves for their animals, dry maize stalks stacked up on trees, given to the animals in small rations. But residents of this village count themselves lucky. They're among a few villages in the county that have benefited from a Caritas project, a development wing of the Catholic Church, to provide water. They have so far dug 4 boreholes in the area from where locals get a constant supply of water at a meager fee of about $5.
There are times when in our normal engagements with the farmers, we identify a water need. Then from there, we normally engage government professionals to do geology, designs, and then for drilling, we contract, full contract. Then we remain with the works of supervision and ensuring that the communities are part of the whole process, because after the project, we normally hand over the project back to the community.
The boreholes run on solar power, which is plenty here. They're also cheap to maintain. That constant supply of water has transformed parts of this county. Just 18 kilometers away from Mithikwani village, we find Philip Musioka tending to his crops, a stark contrast to much of the county. He grows everything from the staple maize to fruits and vegetables.
For us, we're not experiencing the drought because we're using the borehole to farm. We have enough to eat and we sell the surplus.
This small piece of land is a lifeline for Philip and his family. With a reliable water source throughout the year, he's able to farm a variety of vegetables and fruits. It's a good indicator of the potential Kitui County has to become food secure. Back in Mithikwani village, Mweni is also planning to farm vegetables. She says she planted these trees to test how well they would grow. She is pleased with their progress and is convinced that she can grow whatever crops she likes. Small steps, but ones that make a difference between life and death in places such as this one. Steps that restore human dignity and spur socio-economic development. Steps that most people in Kitui County hope can be possible to make. Penina Karibe, CGTN, in Kitui County, Kenya.
Over to Sudan now. Reports say that a government formation is close. Sudan TV is quoting the Armed Forces Chief Spokesperson Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's media advisor, saying that there will be in consensus among all Sudanese. Now, earlier on, the ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok said that he wants a return to the state of affairs before the military takeover as a condition for any kind of dialogue. Hamdok denied reports that he's agreed with the military to lead a new government. The African Union's envoy has arrived in the capital Khartoum for talks.
The High Representative is in Sudan, meeting the head of the Sovereign Council. The chairperson of the Commission is engaging with the Prime Minister, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, knowing fully well that the African Union is the architect of the current political cohabitation that exists in Sudan. We know that the Sudan situation is very, very dire. We know that the situation is precarious, security, political governance, but we call for dialogue. We call on all stakeholders to come around the table and sit around. Any military intervention will not solve the challenges on our continent, because the challenges need multi-track, multi-purpose, multi-dimensional response.
On to Uganda now. Businesses over there still continue to suffer given the extended closure of schools. The Ugandan government says school operations will only resume in January 2022 after about 5% of the adult population has been vaccinated against COVID. Here's Isabel Nakiria with the details.
Jackson Jingo has shelved his stationery stock for close to 2 years now. He's not made any meaningful sales since school in Uganda was closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Jingo was selling about 75% of his stationery material to schools around Kampala.
Some schools had taken things on credit. They could not pay. Some schools could not, almost all the schools could no longer order for the new items. So the business went almost to negative.
The closure of schools has left businesses like Jingo's struggling to stay afloat. Many now depend on walk-in customers, which doesn't fetch much. This street in downtown Kampala is a one-stop center for stationery material. Many of the traders here were making big sales to schools before the pandemic broke, but now business is slow. The UN Children's Fund says Uganda has kept schools closed longest globally, despite registering low coronavirus cases. Business people like Jingo say this has left them in losses and recovery may take long.
Some schools have closed. You find a school, you give them your item, but it is closed. Some directors left the business. Some schools, in fact, have been converted into rentals.
For farmers like Abdul Chibalama, tons of his food went to waste in the garden. He used to supply schools with cassava, sweet potatoes, and bananas. He also owns forest plantations, and this is his only hope.
Cassava with also potato, because also potato does like that. If it is time to harvest, you have to remove it. But if you don't get somebody to buy, then what will you do? You know, since this COVID, food was here in plenty, and you could not take somebody there to buy.
The government has announced full reopening of schools in January, but business people like Jingo and Chibalama do not think recovery will be immediate, as many schools will have to deal with more pressing issues like bank loans. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Now, the 4th China International Import Expo is set to kick off in Shanghai on the 5th of November. A record 3,000 foreign companies are set to showcase their products and services in the course of that event. African companies, of course, are looking to get access to a market of 1.4 billion people too. China is Namibia's largest importer and second largest importer. And the South African nation has significant expectations from this event. The executive director of the Namibian Ministry of Industrialization and Trade, Haihambo Shikongo, says that China increased the total trade volume with Namibia while giving donations in order to ease the impact of the pandemic at the same time. Namibia's exports to China went up from $1.2 billion in 2018 to $1.9 billion in 2020. It's time for a short break. We're back with more news in about 30 seconds.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. These are some of the stories making you headlines at this hour. Starting in Ethiopia, the country's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has pledged his government will vanquish the country's enemies. He made the remarks on the one-year anniversary of the start of the war in the northern region of Tigray. A moment of silence was observed at a candlelit ceremony to commemorate those killed on the 3rd of November 2020. The Ethiopian government has now imposed a 6-month-long state of emergency. Tigrayan forces have indicated they will advance on the capital of Addis Ababa after claiming to have taken significant territory in the northern part of Ethiopia. In Sudan, the ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has insisted on a return to the state of affairs before the military takeover on the 25th of October as a condition for any kind of dialogue. Hamdok denies reports that he's agreed with the military to lead a new government. According to him, he will only cooperate to reach a settlement when those who've been arrested in the wake of that particular coup are released and the governing bodies have been formally restored. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a group of rebels have attacked several areas in the eastern city of Bukavu. The gunfire exchange between the attackers and defense forces is reported to have killed 6 assailants and 2 soldiers. According to the South Kivu province's governor, some 36 militants have been captured to date. It's not clear at this point which militia group exactly was behind the attack, but local authorities are blaming a rebel group that they're calling the CPC 64. Investigations are underway. That's a run through your headlines. Away from the continents now, the UK and France are back at the negotiating table trying to defuse a row over post-Brexit fishing licenses in UK waters. This comes in the wake of President Emmanuel Macron's decision to delay his threat to stop UK fishermen from landing their catches at French ports while talks continue. Michael Voss has the latest.
For the moment, it's fishing as usual, though no one knows whether the bitter dispute between France and Britain will be resolved or escalate into a damaging economic trade war. France had threatened to close its ports to British fishermen after the UK denied licences to fish in its waters to a number of small French vessels. Britain threatened retaliations of its own. It was a row which had the potential to overshadow the UN climate conference, but late on Monday, France's President Macron announced that the threat was on hold. Britain welcomed the de-escalation and made conciliatory statements of its own.
We've always been clear that we're open to further dialogue on that, and that if there's new evidence that can be brought to bear, then obviously we would consider that. We want to license any vessel that qualifies under the terms of the agreement we reached a year ago.
The island of Jersey, the British dependency in the English Channel at the centre of the row, announced that it had issued another 49 licences to French fishermen. But in the French fishing port of Granville, no one is sure how the talks will progress.
During the last negotiations, there were 49 licences granted. It's not enough. There are still 200 boats pending. It's nothing at all. 49 licences.
We don't know what to expect. We learn new things every day. We don't know if we have the right to fish or not. For the moment we have a licence, but others are still waiting for it. We will not give up until everyone has obtained a licence.
There is another outstanding issue which remains unresolved, with the impounded British fishing vessel still being held at a French port, despite earlier reports it would be released. Four-way talks between Britain, France, Jersey and the European Union will get underway on Thursday. Michael Voss, CGTN.
Now then, let's explore what's new, what's hot and what's hip in the realm of culture in China and around the world. This is an all things culture journey that we're inviting you to be a part of. In today's show, we'll be focusing on the trending art scene. We'll be taking you on a tour to Shanghai, Qingdao, and Russia's St. Petersburg. What's so captivating about these exhibits and events? Robots, AI and futuristic ideas are right among them.
The butterflies on the screen were created by using generative adversarial networks, or GANs. GANs are models that create near-realistic sounds and images. It's widely used in image, video, and voice generation.
蝴蝶项目已经有100万只的体量，就每一只蝴蝶都不一样。
The AI has generated 1 million virtual butterflies in 2 years, and no two are alike. It means that it is working almost every minute, which is impossible if you're creating art in a traditional way.
创作者来说是不可想象的。
At the art center, 30,000 of these virtual butterflies are offered to visitors for free.
This one seems nice. I'll take this one.
The butterfly was airdropped to my phone. It was deleted from the art center's database after it was transferred to me.
The number in the corner that I'm hiding from you serves as a certificate, proving that I am the exclusive owner of this piece of art. So if you manage to get one of these exclusive butterflies, remember to blur the number if you want to share it on social media.
If you think the butterflies are a little elementary, check out this painting.
At the first glance, I thought it was a Renaissance oil painting, but it was actually also created by using GANs. The artist team obvious that once the artificial intelligence started creating, no human intervention was involved. The AI even signed its work here.
Then comes the question, is AI artistic? A Tongji University professor studying in automated design and AI says yes.
Art needs liberation. You need to be free from this world of material things. So the AI is the way to go. The whole world is right now changing, and AI actually reflects that change into this world that is coming. So we are able now to see things and to do things that we couldn't do, which basically shows that we as humans, we are able to exceed ourselves. And that's a good thing.
The portrait is from a series of 11 paintings depicting a fictitious family. Another painting from this series was sold for about $500,000 in 2018 at Christie's. It was the first time an AI-generated piece was sold in a major auction house. Some visitors show interest in the AI-generated art and want to collect such pieces.
AI-generated art looks surprising. For traditional forms of art, you may be able to figure out how it was created, but you cannot figure out how the algorithm created the work. I think the value of AI-generated work will increase in the future.
I really like this kind of artwork and would like to collect them. Each one of them is unique, generated by AI after it learned and improved itself. If you miss one, you may never be able to find it again.
As the AI technology grows stronger, some people have expressed concerns about a Terminator-like AI takeover. But a professor from Tongji University doesn't think there will be an AI apocalypse. However, adding that there are other things to worry about.
The real worries are others, are the ethical and social implications of AI. For instance, AI, when we look for a job, is already scrutinizing our own resume. When we ask for a loan, is already assessing the risk of default on our side. I mean, AI is narrowing progressively our vision of the reality. In this sense, it's controlling us.
The exhibition titled Book of Sand was named after a short story by Argentine magical realist author Jorge Luis Borges. The novel is about a book with infinite pages. The protagonist in the novel is fascinated at first, but later becomes frightened, realizing the book is endless. The story is quite similar to the situation we're now in with AI. Many people are fascinated by it, while others fear its endless potential. Before AI could really control the world, you may as well enjoy some of the artwork before it happens. Zhang Hong, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
All right, then, away from AI and art, let's move on to commodities. Brent futures have gone up by around 4.4% from the 1st of October to date. WTI futures up 7% over the same period. Now, compare that to the 6.5% and 4.9% rise in Brent and WTI, respectively, over all of Q3. With supply problems still, of course, battering plant yields and the anchor producer of Brazil, coffee prices still continue to rise in international markets. Futures due in December are trading over $210, up 56% in the last 10 months. Now, our last story comes over from Nigeria. Horse breeding is fast gaining traction over there, particularly in the country's north. The rise in demand is occasioned by a number of reasons: military parades, royal events, but also sports like polo and horse racing. Northwestern state of Kaduna is known for breeding, training and selling select horses. As CGTN's Kelechi Mekalamna reports, many are now cashing in.
Ahmed Mohammed is particularly fond of Dogalina, his Argentine stallion. He started out as a poultry farmer about 2 decades ago. With his fascination for horses, he then veered into horse breeding. Ahmed trains and sells horses ranging from the locally bred to the Sudanese and exotic Argentine thoroughbred horses. Depending on the age and breed, a horse sells for around 7,500 and even more, bringing in good business returns.
Last year into this year, we bred about 13 horses. We've sold 12. Only the young foal of about 6 months that is still here. And somebody has indicated interest.
Horse breeding in Nigeria predates the colonial era. The animals were used for intertribal wars, transportation, parades, sports and royal keepsakes. But it's considered an elitist and capital-intensive trade. Ahmed says support, funding and interest for the locally bred horses have been low.
This is something new. Nobody has attempted it. And we have been skeptical, trying to present a business plan to the banks because it's something we do not think they will support. But we're trying to see how we can discuss with some of our bankers to see if they will be willing to provide us loans. One of the challenges again is acceptance by the elite to patronize locally bred horses.
Ahmed's been practicing horse rescue. He acquires injured or sick horses for far less. He then treats and rehabilitates them. He currently has a total 31 horses in his stable after exporting to Mali, Niger and other neighboring African countries. He believes with government support and funding, horse breeding can generate massive revenues and create employment. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Quick update as far as currencies are concerned. We'll focus on the Kenyan shilling with respect to currencies. It continues its steady run of losses against the American dollar. Probably not as fast as a galloping filly, but still at a steady pace, down to 111.49 in today's session. The currency has now been weakening for 5 consecutive months. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. Well, today's up next from Washington, D.C.